Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked recently to consider what the implications would be for crime and the criminal justice system if indefinite human life extension were achieved, and if human beings began to live much longer than they do today without an upper bound on their life expectancies. First, I think crime in general would decline dramatically. One of the fundamental motivations for crime is acquisition of material prosperity where the criminal perceives that there are not legitimate ways of doing so, or the criminal perceives himself to be at a competitive disadvantage in pursuing prosperity legitimately. Now, I understand that's not the motivation for all crimes, but it is for many. So, with indefinite human life extension, humans are going to have many more opportunities to achieve prosperity. And failure at one of them, or fear of failure at one of them even, is not going to be as much of a deterrent to prudent planning for the future, and planning with a much longer time horizon. If you have several hundred or several thousand years in which you anticipate to be alive, it would cost you much more to break the law now and get punished for it, or to infringe on someone's rights and get punished for it, than it would if you had a much lower life expectancy. At the same time, the consequences of financial failure in a legitimate enterprise are much less ruinous because you have a lot more time to try to rebuild your fortunes after that. Essentially, if you have an enterprise that failed or an occupation where you didn't succeed and may have even incurred financial losses, you have many more years to try again, to try to rebuild that or try to pursue something else. And you have those opportunities legitimately without having to resort to crime. Furthermore, a big reason why crime would decline is that the valuation placed on an individual human life would increase greatly. If, for instance, a murderer takes a human life, that's no longer depriving a person of 20 to 60 years of future life. It would be a deprivation of an indefinite amount of future life, perhaps 500 years or 1,000 years or even more. So it would be seen as a much more heinous act to do that. And as a result, I think many people will form far more internal inhibitions from committing crime than they do at present. Right now, at least for a sizable minority of people, there are only two external inhibitions from committing crime. One of them is the law and the fear of punishment. Another one is essentially a kind of religious fear, a fear of punishment from an external cosmic enforcer, from a god. And it is a bit scary to live in this kind of world, where one knows that a sizable percentage of one's fellow human beings do not rule out the infringement of other individuals' rights or the use of violent force categorically, that they rule it out only because of external deterrence. However, I think that value system will change with indefinite human life extension. It will change because every time there's a death, so much more will be lost. And the consequences of that are going to be perceived much more starkly. Right now, if a person dies, it is seen as a tragedy in most circumstances, but death is so prevalent, so ubiquitous throughout the world, that it's just seen as one among a huge number of tragedies, and it becomes eventually a statistic. However, when death, especially death from murder, becomes the exception rather than the rule, when the rule is that human beings live and keep on living happily and prosperously, and very few really terrible things will happen to them in the course of their continued indefinite lives, then those exceptions are going to be much, much more noticed, and there's going to be a lot more outrage about it. And that outrage is going to create cultural change toward how crime is perceived, how murder and theft and mutilation and rape are perceived. Because you're taking away a lot more with those crimes from a person who lives indefinitely than from a person who today has a fairly strict upper bound on his or her life expectancy. Now, with that being said, it's not entirely clear how this would affect criminal punishment. It could go one of several ways. On the one hand, it could be thought that because this criminal act is so terrible, especially with regard to the worst crimes, with regard to murder, because a murder takes so much of a person's life, it will be seen as deserving of higher punishments than exist today. However, there's another side to that coin, and that is certain punishments, such as imprisonment today, would have a much greater impact if the person who is punished also lives indefinitely. So if a person gets life in prison, it's no longer 20 to 60 years of prison time. It would be an indefinite amount of prison time, especially if it's life in prison without the possibility of parole. A legitimate question could arise as to whether there would be a death penalty in a society where there is indefinite human life extension. Now, on the one hand, some people might argue, well, that's only fair, because this person took away so much from another human being that this person doesn't deserve to be alive either, and at the very least, this person's life expectancy needs to be shortened. Now, what form would that death penalty take, if it even exists, is an open question. Perhaps the so-called death penalty in that society wouldn't be execution, which can be fairly brutal and can also, in many cases, target the wrong person. There may instead be a decision not to subject that person to artificial life-extending treatments. So the so-called death penalty might just be deprivation of that person of the fruits of medical progress. So that person would still have his life expectancy as it would be today, but he wouldn't get life extension therapies. That might be the form that a, quote, death penalty takes in that future society. And what it could achieve in that form is, first of all, a fairer appeals process, where just because the executioner got to the person before a court stayed the execution, that wouldn't result in the possible taking of an innocent life. Instead, there would be a much longer time period to determine true guilt or innocence. And second, it could do away with a lot of the costs of execution today. One little-known statistic is that it actually costs more these days to execute someone on death row than to keep that person in prison for the rest of his or her life. And there are many reasons for that. The execution techniques are part of that. The various bureaucracies that surround the imposition of the death penalty are another part of that. The costs of protracted appeals, of course, are a part of that. But I think many people would hold the view that having those appeals is a necessary safeguard to ensure that an innocent person isn't wrongfully put to death. So with regard to the death penalty itself, I'm quite ambivalent in its present form. I'm ambivalent about whether it's possible to have enough confidence in condemning a person to death and knowing that that person is actually guilty of the crime. There have been cases where DNA evidence has exonerated people many decades after the fact of the crime. But I'm also very wary of having governments in their present form have the power of life or death over their own citizens, because we have seen time and again how that power has been abused and directed toward people who are entirely innocent. But in an environment of indefinite life extension, maybe there could be a workaround around this issue. After all, there are some heinous criminals, and just because medical science will have progressed, that will not eliminate all of those criminals. So if someone commits horrific atrocities, horrific rape murders, or serial killings, I think a legitimate argument could be made that that person deserves death. It's a question of how will that death occur? And perhaps the approach that I outlined previously, where the death penalty in this future society will be deprivation from life extension therapies, and essentially allowing that person to live the pre-indefinite life extension human lifespan, probably in prison or in another venue where that person is separated from the rest of society. That could be a humane solution, but that could also be an effective way to get rid of these criminals and to punish them for what they had done. Because think about it, if that person's life expectancy is 80, but everyone else has an average life expectancy of 1,000, this kind of so-called death penalty would deprive that person of more than 9/10 of his or her life expectancy that would otherwise be the case. That would be a great deterrent from murder. With regard to other crimes, once again, there would be fewer of them, but I think in a society where there is indefinite life extension, there would be more of a focus toward restitution. The idea is, if you stole something from someone, or if you injured someone in a certain way, there would be more opportunities to repair that damage. One, because of medical science, say, in treating injuries that are currently irreversible. And two, because of economic progress. So it would be faster and easier to undo economic damage or financial damage. So let's say someone is guilty of reckless behavior that injures another human being. And let's say, for this particular illustration, it's not a civil wrong, but a criminal wrong, because with a civil wrong, it would still be, even in today's environment, a matter of paying restitution. But let's say it's a criminal wrong. Let's say this person was a gang member who pulled a knife on another individual and really did some damage. Damage that would be irreparable and would have paralyzed that individual today, but in this future society could be repaired through medical science. So then, it becomes less sensible to imprison that individual for a long period of time. It becomes more sensible to put that individual to work and garnish his or her earnings to pay for the treatment for that injury, even if it's a criminal wrong. Right now, there is this stark division in the criminal justice system where, for a civil wrong, the civil justice system does something entirely different. It's focused mostly on damages and restitution, whether it's economic restitution or non-economic restitution in the form of pain and suffering damages. But the criminal justice system sees the wrong as being committed not against the person, but against the entire society. And so there are punishments that are set by statute, that if you commit a crime of this sort, you will get a sentence in prison ranging from this number of years to this number of years, or you will get a fine of a certain amount, irrespective of what the actual damage was. And I think the reason why this arose in large part, without attributing any cynical motivations to anyone, is that many crimes have irreparable consequences, particularly when you consider injury or death. And with those crimes, it's very difficult to put a monetary amount on the damage that was inflicted. So there's a kind of proxy for that now in terms of time spent in prison. But what if in the future, based on technological and economic progress, it becomes possible to repair more of that damage? Well, that's going to change how it is seen. there's going to be much more focus on actually repairing that damage and perhaps going above and beyond that and compensating for other aspects of the suffering that was inflicted. And there would be a move away from this idea of just serving time because of a crime against, quote, society in general. So those are my thoughts on how indefinite life extension could affect crime and the criminal justice system. By no means is this the only possible interpretation, and I've had to do a bit of thinking myself to figure out which way it would go in situations where it seemed ambiguous. So by all means, I invite you, if you have different thoughts, different expectations, to voice your ideas as well, because I would be quite interested to see and hear them.